Okay, this is TempleOS 5-minute random code walkthrough, episode 100, and I'm your host, Terry Davis. And we are in the hard drive ATA code, ATA probe. Okay, so there are I/O ports, which there's 16 bits, 65536 different I/O ports. There's memory, and then there's I/O. Memory space, and then there's I/O space. So an I/O port is 16 bits, 1024 different values. And a hard drive, or CD-ROM, the old style, you accessed with two sets of I/O ports. Okay, so I have to identify which port. I have to identify when it boots. I don't know the CD-ROM drive that it booted from, and I have to probe in order to determine. There's ATA probe is used when I try to test for a CD-ROM. Basically there's two sets of ports, and what this routine does is it gets device ID. Okay, for a certain, I make a guess at the I/O ports, and then I read them. It's a little bit dangerous because a wrong guess could screw something up. It's not likely to corrupt anything, but it could crash. There's some standard port locations, such as, well, first it tries to get them the correct way, and then it tries to check the old standard primary master and primary and secondary IDE. Anyway, 1F03F6 is the primary IDE, and 170376 is the secondary IDE. And it turns out that when you boot with the BIOS, that's different from UEFI is the new way of booting. With the old way of booting, you use interrupt 13, and you use interrupt 13. Where's interrupt 13? Here it is. You use interrupt 13, and you pass the drive number in DL. It starts in 16-bit mode, and DL, when it calls your bootloader, when the BIOS calls your bootloader, DL has this is the BIOS number for the CD-ROM. But there's no way to convert the BIOS CD-ROM to I/O ports. The BIOS CD-ROM number in DL is no good for accessing I/O ports. And so basically we have to probe all the different, let's see if I use this anywhere else. I think this is only used for finding the CD-ROM, or I could be wrong, but I think so. Oh no, it's used there too. Okay. For probing. So notice what I did. F is that's your best friend. FATA, you can quickly scan all the code. So there's an ATA report probe. This it checks. I have a primary IDE and secondary IDE. ATAPI is CD-ROM, and ATA is hard drive. Anyway, so I think it checked. There's unit 0 and unit 1, and when I probed, I determined that unit 1 did not exist. So I determined that unit 1 did not exist. ATA rep checks primary. It tries to make an entry for primary. Oh, let's see. First it tries to find them. There's what's called a PCI BIOS, and what that is it's a 32-bit BIOS that has a handful of where would that be? The PCI BIOS has a handful of you can read config space, or you can write config space, or you can try and find a device class. That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to find the CD-ROM the correct way with this find PCI class. You have to know the codes. If you look on the internet for PCI or for PCI class codes, then you can call this and it will identify a device class like SATA or ATA or IDE, and all three of those can be for ATA devices. Anyway, so that then you read the config space in order to find out the port numbers, and then from then on you can just use the port numbers and not use PCI. There's PCI rep. This tells us, let's see if we identify the SATA. Let's see where SATA is, or ATA. There's a SCSY. Is that what I'm using? I don't think I'm using SCSY. How could I be using SCSY? I don't even know which one of these. Maybe we didn't find it. Anyway, VMware allows primary and secondary IDE to function. I don't even know which PCI device it is actually. Anyway, so when you boot on native hardware, it might ask you for the port numbers for the CD-ROM. If it can't find it, it asks you for the port numbers. And anyway, so, oh well.